Final Fantasy VII was a phenomenon. In 1997, this game launched the Final Fantasy franchise into the stratosphere. For many gamers, this was their first exposure to the series, and it has created millions of lifetime fans. To date, the game has sold over 12 million units worldwide, and it continues to sell really well on various platforms. However, you don't have to spend more than a few minutes on any Final Fantasy forum or Facebook group before stumbling over this debate. For some fans, Final Fantasy VII is Square's magnum opus, the greatest accomplishment that the company has ever made. Never to be duplicated in 23 years. For others, it's an overrated flash in the pan, a commercial and critical success undeserving of its massive reputation. I'm not here to argue either of these points. On the contrary, I'm here to ask a question. In a series with 60 titles, including spin-offs and remakes, is this game from 1997 really the best in that whole series? Or is the popularity more due to nostalgia than objective quality? Let's talk about it.
For this video, I captured footage using the PC version with the Remake mod. I strongly recommend playing this version of the game, if at all possible. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to help this channel grow. Thank you. Let's dive in. When discussing Final Fantasy VII, the biggest pro is definitely the story. This may be one of the best stories ever told using the medium of video games. In the beginning, Final Fantasy VII appears to be a story about a former Special Operations soldier teaming up with a group of eco-terrorists trying to take down Shinra Corporation, whose exploitation of Mako energy is threatening to destroy the planet. Before long, Square starts peeling back the layers and reveals that the hero is confused by the memories of another much more heroic character, and that Shinra's exploitation of Mako is not the only thing threatening the world. The stunning parallel to our own world, the very real exploitation of petroleum that is a very credible threat to the future of our world, and the greed involved in that exploitation, has aged well, as it is still a concern today. Additionally, the threat of corporations having incredible influence over our government is every bit as valid now as it was 20 years ago. From the moment you walk into the Seventh Heaven bar, you can tell that you've encountered something really special. The story is powerful and nuanced in its similarity to real-world problems, and told in beautiful detail through dialogue that is greatly expanded from previous entries in the series. There are plenty of surprises in this riveting tale, and it works very hard to make an emotional connection to the player. From the devastating moment when Barrett thinks Marlene has been crushed by the plate, to the tragic death of Aerith and everything in between, Final Fantasy VII makes the player care about these characters. Whether it's Red 13 learning the truth about his father's heroic actions, or the terrible story of Vincent and his lost love, there's no denying how powerful this story truly is. These are, after all, fully developed and fleshed out characters. Cloud is a tortured ex-soldier, taciturn and hard-boiled. The righteous and hot-tempered Barrett has a strong sense of justice and a potty mouth to match. Tifa is unflinchingly loyal, emotionally guarded, and a little naive. She's also the greatest waifu in gaming history, of course. Aerith is outgoing, inquisitive, friendly, and fun, despite carrying a great burden. She's incredibly charming, and players can't help but fall in love with her. Red 13 is courageous, proud, and trustworthy. Cait Sith, who is really Reeve of the Turks, has a conscience that leads him to redemption as he travels with Cloud and the gang. His empathy overshadows his sense of duty. Cid is a resentful old man seeking to fill the void left by the loss of his dream. Yuffie is deeply patriotic, willing to do anything to restore the glory of Wutai, cunning enough to trick Cloud and his friends, and moral enough to know she was wrong. Vincent is deeply sad, a walking monument to unmanageable heartbreak, and a true goth icon. Even the supporting cast, including the villainous Turks, reveal pieces of themselves to the player, which remind us that even our enemies are people who are trying to live their lives and do what they believe to be right. The story is told through expanded dialogue and 3D rendered cutscenes. The cutscenes do look a little outdated today, but in 1997, nothing like this had ever been seen before on a home video game console. The use of cutscenes like these set the stage for a revolution, not just in RPGs, but in video games as a whole. Visually impressive cutscenes will become a staple of video games that still persists to this day. Final Fantasy VII follows the monomyth, a literary standard used in many works of fiction, going all the way back to classic mythology and persisting today as a blueprint for any story in which a hero takes a journey. This was famously defined by Joseph Campbell, a professor of literature. This elevates storytelling in a video game to that of a legitimate work of literature. You may recognize this framework from movies like Star Wars or Harry Potter. Cloud's journey takes him beyond the walls of Midgar in a quest of trial, rebirth, and ultimately, redemption. If you'd be interested in seeing an in-depth analysis of Final Fantasy VII and the monomyth, or just a literary analysis of Final Fantasy VII in general, I would love to do one. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. For many of us, Final Fantasy VII was the first game we played where the hero fails. Cloud fails to stop Sephiroth at the Temple of Ancients. He fails to save Aerith. And we feel that failure deeply. We feel the loss of Aerith deeply. We feel Cloud's pain, his confusion, his desire to give up. And when the final showdown between Cloud and Sephiroth takes place, we feel that triumph just as deeply. The world building of Final Fantasy VII is excellent, especially in the beginning. As the player explores Midgar, an amazing post-apocalyptic environment unfolds before you. It's impossible not to feel a sense of oppression and the plight of the common people, whose circumstances are just beyond their control. You can feel and see their helplessness. Midgar is a crazy place, but it makes sense in the logic of the game world. The wealthy live up top and the poor live on the bottom. The positioning of the reactors and the plates follows the rules and logic of the game universe. It feels like an industrial slum where the people have hobbled together homes and carved out lives for themselves and a society in the face of insurmountable odds. You can feel the strength and fortitude of the people of Midgar. When you climb the wall and arrive at the top of the plate, everything is very bright. The Shinra headquarters looks like a monument to imposed order and opulence. Story, character, and world building are all critical elements in any work of fiction. But does Final Fantasy VII elevate its video game elements, graphics, sound, and gameplay to the same level as it does its lore? Gamers familiar with the Final Fantasy series, or maybe we should say franchise, myself included, couldn't help but be blown away by these 3D environments. It feels much more dynamic than the top-down environments of the previous games in the series. A dash button is available from the start, which is a huge quality of life improvement, and the cinematic flow of gameplay integrates seamlessly with the storytelling sequences. Battles are now rendered in 3D, and while the characters still line up and move back to their original position after each turn, heroes now travel across the battlefield to strike the enemy, rather than standing in place. Enemy models are now fully animated, no longer just still images. Camera angles change as the action moves forward. Spell effects are flashy and detailed, and summoned monsters are fully rendered, fully animated 3D models that take over the entire battlefield with their immense presence. It evokes a feeling of magnitude for sure. There's plenty of optional content, including 2 hidden heroes and several hidden enemy bosses. There are lots of materia to collect and many different challenges to overcome. One thing that really stands out in Final Fantasy VII is the presence of fun and well-built minigames, from the motorcycle and submarine games to the bigger minigames like excavation and chocobo breeding. There are a lot of things to do, and they're almost all a lot of fun. As always, the score is incredible, and this may be some of Uematsu's best work. The CD quality sound is a huge improvement over the beeps and blips of the previous console generation, and it really shines in anthems like Bombing Mission, Genova, and One Winged Angel. I have read before that this was not CD quality audio, and I'm really not totally sure about that, so if you have correction for me about that, let me know in the comments. I understand that the PS1's internal audio processor was used. I'm not really too sure how all that works, so if someone has more information about the tech involved in making that music happen, please let me know. As good as the story is, once you get to Disc 2, it gets really convoluted and kind of difficult to follow. I think everyone remembers the story fondly because of Disc 1. But once you encounter Sephiroth at the North Crater, suddenly Sephiroth isn't Sephiroth, Cloud isn't Cloud, and then a little while later he is, but then he isn't really. It's not even ever made clear whether the character you're playing as is a Sephiroth clone or not, and ultimately it doesn't seem to really matter. The story of Sephiroth's birth, Hojo, Lucretia, Mako, it all gets really confusing, and although I've played through the game a few times and even watched some summary videos of the story, a good portion of it still doesn't really make that much sense to me. That is to say nothing of all the retconning that happened when they extended the universe with Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus. The most jarring thing that I noticed though, being a Final Fantasy veteran and all, is the restriction of having only 3 party members in your group at any given time. Originally, this was a consequence of the PlayStation's low polygon count, or so I've been told. This would become a standard for the genre through 2 console generations. This really threw me because in previous installments, you could always have 4 or more characters in your party. There's always logic to this. You needed a dedicated healer, a character who could deal magic damage, a character who could deal physical damage, and a character who could soak up enemy attacks. This balance also relied on having specific character classes, another staple of the franchise and the RPG genre as a whole that was conspicuously absent from Final Fantasy VII. These characters don't have classes at all, and while there are subtle differences between the base stats, there's nothing really determining what role any given party member should be fulfilling, with the exception of Aerith, of course, and Cloud to a smaller degree. Instead, balancing the party is left up to the player by assigning materia to each character. In theory, this means you can make each character fulfill whichever role you would like within the limitations of the materia system. This falls apart on 2 fronts. First, having only 3 party members means you have to choose 3 of those roles to fill, and second, because the materia system doesn't have nearly enough limitations to make this worthwhile. Characters take penalties or receive bonuses based on which materia they equip. In theory, this should empower the player to craft whatever type of character they want. It seems to give you ultimate freedom, but it's fundamentally a broken system. First, you're limited by the number of materia slots in your items, so the combination of materia you want may not be possible. Additionally, you may have unused slots. Unused slots means you have materia in your inventory that is not being leveled up, so it's unwise to leave a slot empty. Furthermore, the penalties to hit points and defense become negligible when moving characters to the back row. Because all characters can use magic and summons, there's really nothing stopping the player from simply equipping the most powerful magic and summon materia available, placing all 3 party members in the back row, and nuking every enemy into oblivion. When the game first came out in 1997, that's really how we all played it. This brings up another really big flaw with the materia system. Unlike Final Fantasy VI, where your characters permanently learn a spell when they collected enough AP, materia's effects and abilities only last as long as they're equipped. When a materia is unequipped and given to another character, that character inherits the abilities and spells. Because of this, making characters more powerful, a fundamental building block of role-playing games and one of the things that makes them enjoyable to play, is missing. The only abilities differentiating the characters from each other are limit breaks. But by and large, the limit breaks just do damage. There are a few exceptions, but largely they're just visual. Unlike Final Fantasy VI, where each character had a special ability that made them unique, limit breaks do little to set the characters apart. If you want to build character attributes, you have to use source items. Like Materia, these items are highly exploitable and they can be used to simply max out your stats for all characters. On the point of Materia being exploitable, you can one-shot a lot of enemies and even a lot of bosses, make yourself immortal, or just spam the game's most powerful spell against any enemy with no limitations. You can even get 8 Omni Slashes per turn and do over 1 million damage. These broken game systems make the player characters feel overpowered, even at the worst of times, and leave the game entirely too easy. Even the super bosses, Ruby and Emerald Weapon, can be beaten really easily if you know how to exploit the materia. Unless you willingly hamstring yourself, there's nothing stopping you from bulldozing the bulk of the game's content. The equipment has also been simplified to allow for only 1 piece of armor, which takes away the fun of gearing up a character and further limits the distinction between character types and classes. A fundamental building block of RPGs is once again left on the cutting room floor. Not only is there only 1 piece of armor, but all the characters can wear the same armor. Gone is the excitement of getting a new piece of armor that enhances the abilities of your favorite character. Instead, you buy 3 of the same bracelet and give it to everyone. This, combined with the way that negative statuses disappear after a battle for the first time in Final Fantasy history, it just all speaks to this overall dumbing down of the gameplay experience. I understand to a point why this was done. In order to appeal to a larger audience, including those unfamiliar with JRPGs or RPGs in general, cutting away some of the more complicated or tedious or challenging elements clearly went a long way. After all, the game was very successful, but it does leave a really large hole in the overall feel of the game. Finally, the cartoony character models really took me out of the experience. There's so much gravity to a lot of what's happening on screen, but a lot of the subtext and depth is missed because of these goofy piles of pixels. Despite how impressive it was to have 3D models at the time, I think more serious, grown-up looking character models would have made a huge difference in communicating the themes of the story. I think that the remake is going to be really, really great in this capacity. On that note, whose idea was it to have a giant stuffed animal in your party? Cait Sith is probably the worst character design in video game history. When it comes to which Final Fantasy games succeeded where 7 failed, it's pretty clear that there were defined and delineated classes and roles in most games in the series, especially in the 8 and 16-bit eras. The original Final Fantasy used a classic role-playing game system. Melee fighters had higher strength and defense stats and could do more physical damage, while magic users were glass cannons. Final Fantasy III introduced the job system, which allowed players to change character class on the fly, but still maintained a sense of balance. Final Fantasy IV allowed up to 5 characters in the party at a time, and while the party makeup was entirely determined by the story, each character had a class and clearly defined role that fit the classic mold. The Tactics series followed this formula beautifully. 5 greatly improved upon 3's job system. 6 allowed all characters to use magic, but they still had character classes, each with its own special ability. The separation of roles was more obfuscated, but it was still intact. Moreover, the characters learned new spells permanently from their espers. 9 brought back the classic formula, 10 reinvented the wheel. 11 and 14, being MMORPGs, maintained a rigid class and role system. 12 allowed the player to build the characters as they see fit, but those choices were permanent and couldn't be undone simply by changing equipment. While Final Fantasy VIII mimicked virtually every flaw in 7, 10 made a distinction in the single piece of equipment, with given pieces of equipment being exclusive to each character. This was a bit too rigid. Some flexibility is nice, and almost every game in the series offered such flexibility. A secondary melee character might be able to use some of the same armor as a warrior or knight, but not all of it. There may even be some overlap in weapons. This felt more like a real RPG where the player had to make choices that really impacted their experience. Holding the player's hand by having a strict limit to what each character can equip hurts the gameplay experience just as much as allowing any character to equip anything. Now, it would be unfair to not point out that Final Fantasy VII is not alone in its brokenness. Almost every title in the franchise has some elements that are broken and can be exploited. From item duplication tricks, to vanish and X zone in Final Fantasy VI, or min-maxing in pretty much any game in the 32-bit era, brokenness is almost a staple of the franchise. However, no other system in the series is quite as openly exploitable as the Materia system. You're not taking advantage of it by doing things you're not supposed to do. You're taking advantage of it by doing things you are supposed to do. The 8 and 16-bit Final Fantasy games also had very cutesy character models, and this continued in Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy VIII was the first game in the series to try and use realistic-looking character models, and, well, the PlayStation had some limitations in that area. From 10 on, however, we got much more real-looking characters that gave the emotional moments that much more magnitude. Once we could see the expressions on the characters' faces and those faces began to look human, it really made a huge difference. And with the exception of Kina, I don't think any other character comes close to the ridiculousness of Cait Sith. Sorry, bro.
So, okay, Final Fantasy VII isn't perfect. But what it gets right, it gets very right. So, has any other Final Fantasy game done any of those things better?
It's going to be hard to argue that a better story has been told than that of Final Fantasy VII. We've definitely had some great stories from this series, and if I had to hold any other story against it, it would have to be Final Fantasy VI. 6 tells a great story without a central protagonist, and instead it focuses on a group of heroes. Just like 7, each character has notable characteristics and backstory. The key difference is the backstory of many of the characters is told in-depth with playable side missions that explores his or her tragic past. I felt a much stronger connection to Locke with his troubled, forbidden romance, and Setzer with his lost love, Terra with her search for identity, and Edgar with his reluctant acceptance of tremendous responsibility. And this is all done without expensive cinematic cutscenes. The story of the War of the Magi, the greed and ambition of the Emperor, and the madness of Kefka is one of as high quality as that of 7, and has some truly memorable moments, just like the Opera House, the Ghost Train, and the Magitech sequence. It also has a lot of exposition and dialogue, just like 7. The hero also fails in Final Fantasy VI, but without a central character, the player can't help but own that failure. Terra didn't fail, Locke and Celes didn't fail, nor did Sabin or Edgar. It was you. You failed. And that hurts. Is the story objectively better than Final Fantasy VII? Well, that's up to you to decide. I can't make that decision for you. Objectively, I would say it is. If we're going to talk world building, I don't think Square has ever built a world better than Spira. As impressive as Midgar is, Final Fantasy VII suffers from the same syndrome as other games in the series that came before it. The world at large is a sparsely populated place. Small towns and villages are scattered throughout the vast wilderness. These pockets of civilization are separated by miles and miles of hostile terrain, filled to the brim with hideous monsters. It's never made sense in the context of the lore before. You could easily complain about the on-rails nature of Final Fantasy X, but what it gets right is that Spira makes perfect sense. There's an in-universe reason to be traveling along that path, and there's also an in-universe explanation for why the towns are spread far apart. Sin comes and destroys everything, and the people have to rebuild. Only when the player travels to places where the people don't go do they encounter monsters, and the people in the world are well aware of the fiends and take their own measures to protect themselves like the Crusaders. The settlements are not spread apart by large swaths of nothing. The world always feels alive, and there's a strong sense of logic to the way all the pieces fit together. Final Fantasy XII also does this incredibly well, and although there is a great deal more wilderness, the changes in the landscape make sense as you travel from one area to the next, most of the time. Settlements in dangerous areas are walled off or guarded by sentries or patrols. It's another world that feels alive and where all the pieces fit together very well. While the cinematic elements of 7 were a true revelation at the time, every single entry in the franchise has raised the bar. Cutscenes became integrated with gameplay and look better than ever with each release. Even 13 and 15, neither of which I particularly like, have beautiful and captivating cutscenes and cinematic elements. The stories themselves may not be as good, but the way those stories are told just keeps on improving.
So, is Final Fantasy VII Square's magnum opus, or is it a classic that has become overrated due to the combination of nostalgia and breakout hit status? I don't think that I can definitively answer that question. What I can say for sure is that while it elevated the franchise, the RPG genre, and all of video gaming, forever altering the way stories are told in this medium, it did so at the cost of core gameplay elements that feel sorely missing. Square has definitely created better gameplay systems. When I replayed this recently, there was no part of it that I didn't enjoy. While most RPGs have at least some parts that I'm not looking forward to, even tasks like breeding a gold chocobo and grinding to prepare for Ruby Weapon were enjoyable. I had fun playing. While Square crafted an incredible world with amazing presentation, they definitely have surpassed themselves in these areas since. As for the story, you have to decide for yourself. I think 6 is on par with 7, and a little better from not being quite as confusing. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments what your opinion is. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And until next time, game over.